Hello, everyone. We'll just give it another minute as folks are trickling in here. Thanks so much for attending. All right, I think we can go ahead and get started. Hello and welcome, everybody. My name is Craig Kornblum. I'm the program director at Clean Energy for America, and we are so excited to have you here at our first webinar of the year. Before we dive into this conversation, just a couple of housekeeping items up top. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website at the conclusion of the event. Additionally, we'll save the last 10 to 15 minutes of the call for a question and answer session. So if you have any questions for the group or for a specific panelist, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to submit those. And finally, as a reminder, for any members of the media on this call today, this event is on background only. Please do not reuse or reshare the content. It's purely for informational purposes. And without further ado, we have an amazing lineup of speakers on our panel today. Dr. Marshall Cox, a native of Connecticut and current resident, earned his MS in Materials Science and Engineering from Cornell University in May 2004, and his PhD in Electrical Engineering from Columbia University in 2013. Marshall holds over 10 US patents and has published 8 peer-reviewed papers in semiconductor devices, processing, and inorganic synthetic chemistry. He is the founder and CEO of Kelvin, a startup that has developed a financially driven decarbonization pathway for radiator-heated buildings. He has received numerous awards through his work at Kelvin, including the MIT Clean Energy Prize, the Verizon Powerful Answers Award, and the Popular Science Innovation Award. Next, we have Amy Bailey, who is the founder and CEO of Rock Rabbit, making it fast, easy, and reliable to access incentives and capital for home electrification projects. Prior to Rock Rabbit, she spent over a decade at various utilities and government agencies focused on decarbonization technology, policy, and markets. We also have Devin Hampton, who is the CEO of Utility API, whose mission it is to unleash the clean energy revolution by unlocking data. And last but not least, we have Julia Piper, Vice President of Public Affairs at GoodLeap, a leading financial technology company focused on accelerating the deployment of sustainable home solutions, where she oversees government relations and policy-related communications. She also advises GoodLeap's nonprofit organization Give Power, which develops clean water and clean energy systems in communities around the world. Julia is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center think tank and host of the Political Climate podcast. And with that, I will toss it over to Julia to lead today's conversation. Julia.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Craig. It's great to be with everyone here today, and I'm looking forward to this conversation with this great group of panelists. So to tee us up, it feels like, we're seeing the acceleration of the clean energy transition. We're all familiar with that, but in some ways it's the best of times and worst of times. We've got great policy drivers and indicators, but we've also got high interest rates and some challenges on that front. And the reality is a lot of these solutions are deployed at local levels. So it requires not only signals from federal policy, but local jurisdictions, states, and even seeing the Inflation Reduction Act roll out at those state levels. There's a lot of work still yet to do. And that's where the rubber is really going to hit the road. And in determining whether or not we can seize this moment as a country, quite frankly, in catalyzing the energy transition in a way we haven't done yet. We got a lot of pieces on the board, but it feels like we're still playing the game very much. And so we'll kind of unpack a lot of that with some real world examples from these companies that are deploying technologies, innovating with technology, innovating with business models, and the intersections of policy there as well. To frame this up a little further, we'll kind of focus the conversation largely around buildings, not exclusively, but this kind of concept of how do we decarbonize the homes and businesses and infrastructure that we have in America today. It's easy to overlook it when you sometimes look at the top line greenhouse gas emissions. It's something on the order of 13% of US emissions come from buildings. But when you unpack that, the decisions made in these buildings are what's really key. Rewiring America think tank kind of looked at it a different way and found that 42% of US energy emissions come from decisions made in the home. So how we treat consumers, how we treat the business operators is really key, because they're not just controlling the physical building, which is key, but also their transportation, heating and cooling, other elements of the energy ecosystem. And so we're going to kind of focus this conversation around that and new innovative tools like harnessing AI and data and other tools to try and accelerate the clean energy transition, harnessing some of the new tech evolutions that have happened as well. So with that sort of preamble here, I'll tee it up for our moderators to tell us a little bit more about themselves, a little double click beyond their intros, and go right into a little bit of why they think this moment is important for shaping the future of clean energy, sort of the concept we had for this panel. Why is this particularly critical time as we're all hustling away? So maybe, Devin, I'll start with you and we'll go around the horn.
Yeah, appreciate it, Julia. I'm really happy to have the opportunity to be here. I think the top level is really we're talking about the Inflation Reduction Act and policies and market signals. And I think when we call it a generational opportunity, we might actually be like not quite like understating what's happening here in the U.S. and how we had to actually stick this landing to be able to grab this moment. Right? Like, how did you say it? We're playing the game or something like, it's time to win the game.
The pieces are, I made that
The
up.
pieces on the board, right? But it's time to win the game, right? And so,
yeah.
For example, my company, Utility API, we're an enabling company. Our mission is to unleash this clean energy revolution by unlocking data. But like, we're only as good as like making sure that the companies that use our systems can actually be enabled to do what they need to do in the market, right? And so we are kind of in the background supporting this work simply by working with utilities, working with states, and working with over 1,000 clean energy companies across the country to make sure that that infrastructure is available for them to move data around about these homes, about these buildings, about these businesses from an energy utility, for example, to, well, I'll use one of their panelists here, to a Rock Rabbit or to a Kelvin. They need that data to run their services. And the Inflation Reduction Act gives us an opportunity to really build that type of, ecosystem. So, prior to our conversation today, we were talked a bit about like this like idea of like one company does it all or the lone wolf, right? Trying to find the unicorn amongst the innovative companies, when really it's an opportunity to grow this ecosystem together. And I think that's what's so nice about this moment is with the incentives and with the policies that we have in place, we're all rowing in the same direction really for the first time.
Yeah, I'll jump in there. So I was sort of telling a story to the panelists ahead of time. Before joining GoodLeap, where I oversee our public affairs, I was a reporter covering the clean tech industry, and I had a chance to go to China and covered the startup ecosystem there. And one of their startup incubator leaders was talking about their wolf pack approach, that China really sets a goal. They want to go after XYZ issue, and they're going to unleash a pack of startups on it, a pack of companies, and fund them all and let the whole group go after the challenge as a group. They're sort of described, and we can debate whether this is true, but the US has more of a lone wolf mentality that we're going to kind of put all our chips into one solution or the other. Of course, it's a little more diverse than that, but we have this kind of idea that there has to be one unicorn, one big startup, one amazing entrepreneur that solves a lot of the issues, rather than really thinking about the various dynamic elements and various startups who all maybe do the same thing, but in slightly different ways. So just kind of an interesting frame for us to chew on here is, how does America compete globally, and how are we approaching our innovative startup ecosystem, and maybe think of ways we can tweak it. With that context, Amy, I'll go to you next for a little bit more about Rock Rabbit and why you think this is an important moment.
Great. Yeah. Hi, everyone. Really great to be here. Thanks very much for the opportunity. At Rock Rabbit, to provide a little bit more background, we deliver an AI-powered platform and app that makes it very fast, easy, and reliable to find and claim incentives for home electrification projects. So we have kind of a nice problem, actually, that there are a lot of incentives out there coming from a variety of different sources. It's kind of a good situation to be in, but it's quite complex to navigate. And so we make it very easy for plumbers and HVAC contractors, for instance, to use our app when they're on site providing a quote to pre-qualify a project for an incentive bundle, taking into account kind of stacking constraints. They can then incorporate that into their estimate to drive conversion. And then if the homeowner moves forward with a project, they can use our app to then actually claim the funds using a very user-friendly kind of single checklist. And at Rock Rabbit, we are very focused on specifically small contractors, making it a lot easier for the so-called mod pops, that really long tail of installers, to participate in these programs. Like historically, it's been medium or larger contractors that tend to participate in incentives, those that have the wherewithal to actually hire staff. So historically, it's been very pay to play, and so we're trying to level the playing field to democratize access. We also do partner directly with incentive providers, such as utilities and government. So ideally, we would streamline, at the source, and that's actually my own background, coming from a utility background. And so that's another way we can deploy such that no one has to kind of pay for an additional service to actually access incentives. So that's a little bit about us and kind of what we're up to. And it relates very much to kind of why I think it's an important moment right now to shape the clean energy transition. Definitely a +1 on everything that's already been said about being these are generational laws that we're talking about. There's no other way to describe it. It's really exciting. We do have, I think, a very unique opportunity to do things differently this time, and that's baked into the laws, like specifically taking a very equity-focused approach. The old paradigm for different policies and programs for emerging technologies, at least if you were at a utility or government agency, was to kind of let the more wealthy effectively adopt first and draw these technologies down the learning curve, down the price curve, and then they would be more broad-based. I think we're taking a very different approach now. Like that's a very old kind of way of thinking about things, and taking a very equity first approach is what I'm the most excited about with these generational bills.
That's great. I think that, yeah, the more ground up approach this time around. And I think that's really interesting when you talk about the contractor community. A lot of folks don't know even that the Inflation Reduction Act passed. To be honest, we've seen surveys, and that's quite honest for consumers, even for companies as well. And of course, there's a lot of measures in there that tackle many elements of the energy transition, but particularly homes and consumer decisions, businesses' decisions, and they're still just not aware, let alone how that maps onto other rebates you're talking about. And this is I think what I am thinking about. We talk about that nitty gritty work that still has to happen to implement so much of the policies that set the tone, but a lot of work still has to be done. So great that you're tackling some of those key issues. Marshall, over to you.
Thanks, Julia. So yeah, very excited to be here and talk about all this stuff. I think it's a lot of what I want to say has already been said. What Devin and Amy are both working on is super important. We're a bigger company, so we can deal with the incentives, but it is a very big challenge, and I can't imagine how hard it is for those smaller organizations. And we actually use Devin's company, so it is critically important to what we do. To solve a problem, you have to know what the problem is, and we certainly do that. So at Kelvin, our goal is to build a financially driven pathway for bigger, older buildings to decarbonize. These are like the radiator heated buildings you find in big cities. They have the worst economics when it comes to electrification. And so what we do is we have a 3-step process that basically provides a de-risked, financially driven baby step solution towards electrification. We've been doing the first part, an efficiency upgrade for 10 years. And now we're branching into a partial majority electrification approach where you deploy low-cost systems that work in conjunction with existing radiator systems, so that it's not like, hey, building, you have to rip out your system and install this new one you know nothing about. It's, we're going to install this thing for you, building. We're going to finance it through grid services, and it's going to be free, and it will do most of the heating. But if it gets really cold out, your radiator system is still there. And then use that position to gain trust and guide them towards the full electrification solution when it comes time. As everyone's already mentioned, this is a super important time. I think everybody, for the first time that I'm aware of, is really aligned to make this happen. Policy, people who live in these buildings are interested, people who own these buildings are interested. The local governments are pushing for decarbonization. So, and then there's a lot of money that's available too. So for the first time, I believe that all these things can come together to create a package that makes the transition not just cost effective and achievable, particularly for low income communities, but also in a de-risked manner that they can actually make a decision to do so through their board, right? Like real estate's really conservative. They don't do things unless they're very confident in the result.
The opportunity is there for the taking. We just have to still seize it in full. I mean, I don't want to undermine the work that's already happening day to day, but it feels like we are at this pinnacle moment of beginning to catalyze these solutions in a new way. So let's double click on the policy side. We talked about the Inflation Reduction Act. It's a huge piece of federal legislation. There's obviously state developments, local policy developments as well. So if you had to pick one policy, it could be part of the IRA, but let's get specific. What is something you see catalyzing your company and your sector today? And maybe I'll go in reverse order this time. We'll start with you, Marshall, and go back around.
Sure. So it is undoubtedly the greenhouse gas reduction fund, the GGRF. So as a company, we launch the economics of efficiency, decarbonization, whatever, rely on incentives, the cost of the product, incentives, federal, state dollars, and the tax credits from the IRA were super enabling here. But with the economic stack, the capital stack we have for our product, and I assume this is the same for most companies out there, the cost of capital to deploy technology is still a big challenge, right? We are a small company. We've been around for a while, but still, it's a relatively new idea what we're doing. And so if we were going to go to the big banks and say, hey, will you fund roll this kind of deployment for a customer base that doesn't have capital and needs things financed? They'll say, sure, and this is the interest rate. And it'll be a big number because it's risky. They haven't done before. We don't have 30 years of data showing, what the economics are. The GGRF is a new fund funded through the IRA. It's about $27 billion. And it's there specifically to de-risk and to make these newer ideas, basically to provide financing for them so that they can get that traction and show that traction and show that data for those larger organizations to actually get confidence and finance them themselves. And the last thing I'd say about it, it is super important. I think it's going to have a bigger impact than anything we've done historically. And the number of folks who should know about it, who don't, is astounding. Big organizations that provide financing for projects like this. I've spoken to people in the last 6 months who don't know what the GGRF is. And I'm trying to change that.
Yeah. Actually, Devin, I'll go to you next. I think we talked about, you had sort of similar views on the policies that were most important today. So what would you add here?
Yeah, I don't know what the kids say, retweet or something. But I want to put this in
called
context.
X now. Got to get up to speed. It's called X.
Oh yeah, okay. I don't know how. Okay, well, yeah, it shows what I know. But I want to put this in context, right? Like I agree with Marshall. The GGRF is powerful because not only is it helping to change the risk profiles of these investments, but it's set up to be a revolving fund. This money will be in the market for years to come. Where much of the other pieces of the Inflation Reduction Act is it's a one-time or a shorter term, shorter duration. For example, from DOE, the Homes program, or I think from HUD, HERA, these programs that are going to put billions of dollars in the market to do retrofits on homes, right? For example, one state might get $150 million. That's phenomenal. But when you talk about $10,000 to $15,000 or $5,000 to $15,000 per house, that money gets eaten up pretty quickly. So I like to think of some halves of the parts of the Inflation Reduction Act as like kind of the market setters, right? Like this is what's really getting us going. But the GGRF is really the market maker, right? Like this is what can get, like it's almost like you're priming the pump and then you keep it moving. And so I think they were smart whoever wrote this and making it coupled with that kind of give and take. You got to do something to kickstart things and you got to keep it rolling. But for us, I know we're very excited about all the programs that I've already talked about.
Yeah. And we should know, so the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund has a couple different buckets within it. Some money's going directly to states and state energy offices. Other money is going to be rolled out through some nonprofit entities that will then pick sort of subcontractors and additional partners to partner with, coming through the Environmental Protection Agency on the order of, I think, $27 billion or $29 billion. So again, and that's a revolving fund. So to Devin's point, we could see this sort of change markets over time. A lot still we'll have to see on how this rolls out. We're waiting to have the actual announcements of which entities will be the first to receive those funds and then distribute them from there. And I think there'll be a lot of discussions around what kind of business models and partnerships ultimately look like. So a ton of potential. I feel like my message today is like devil's in the details on so much of this stuff. And I think people on the call will probably be supporting a lot of this work, whether you're in a policy role, an investor role, a startup role. We'll have a lot of work to do together. Amy, let's go to you now. What would you highlight as maybe one singular policy you think is really changing the game today?
Yeah, so my own background, it has been focused a bit more on local and regional policy, although I kind of initially cut my teeth in the energy sector at the DOE, so operated a little bit at the federal level. So I'll take a little bit of a kind of counter approach and say that it's maybe not just one single big policy that I would highlight. Like none of them emerged, from a vacuum. there was, a lot of innovation happening at the regional, state, the local levels. And obviously that's a little bit of a self-serving view because I tried to push the envelope, at least in the different places that I was working to kind of demonstrate new technologies. But yeah, I mean, there are a variety of different approaches that are tried. Like, there's so much variation across the US in terms of building stock, in terms of communities, in terms of community needs. So you need those kind of thousand flowers to bloom. And that's been just a really crucial, utilities and local governments have been, I think, a pretty crucial laboratory for proving out different policy and program designs that have ultimately kind of bubbled up to then be baked into, what we're seeing as these big, bold policies now. And so kind of one example would be when I was at Silicon Valley Clean Energy, for instance, a community choice aggregator. We co-developed a REACH code program for all electric building codes that eventually led to dozens of our local governments adopting all electric building codes. And then that was kind of folded into this very much larger kind of state and federal movement on the building code side. There's another example, relates to utility API. I can let maybe Devin share that example, but I would say what happens, at the bottom and bubbles up is also really crucial.
Teed you up nicely, Devin. How would you add on to that real world example?
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate Amy mentioning we have our data platform that is really cut its teeth by working with Silicon Valley Clean Energy, and Amy and her team came up with a program that allowed a young company to offer, in partnership with Silicon Valley Clean Energy, the ability for all these contractors, solar providers, storage providers, demand response, energy services, to get free access to customer data so that they can go off and run their projects, right? And we were able to prove that in Silicon Valley Clean Energy. And this year, that same platform is going to be turned on across the whole state of New York, right? And so it went from a very local level to a state level and beyond. And so those policies are extremely helpful in hopefully supporting what's happening at the federal level, but it flows both ways.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, working at Good Leap, I think the local level has been sort of challenging. We have these great market drivers from the federal side, but we're working on utility regulatory policy to local codes and interconnection and permitting challenges on the distributed energy side specifically, that's very much undercutting the momentum that we have. Just in California today, there was a decision that came out approving higher fixed charges for all residential customers. And so it's a fee you have to pay no matter how much energy you use. And we can debate sort of the right number for that. But it will change the economics of a lot of these clean energy projects. And of course, it's complicated. We're in a time when our grid systems are being strained. We have additional wildfire and storm concerns these days. So we're trying to solve multiple problems at the same time. But for me, it just really highlights how the local level policies are really where the rubber hits the road, and particularly in the regulatory space, which gets even less attention than legislation, I would posit. So there's a lot of work to be done there. It makes me think of a question. I think we may have some folks who work in public policy on the call. I guess maybe Amy, starting with you on this one, because I know you have a background in it. What would be your message to someone who's crafting policies today? Maybe, as a follow-on to the federal laws that have passed, or maybe even more on the local side. What would you highlight for them in terms of how to tap into what the needs of the market are today, now that you also wear a startup hat as well?
Yeah, great question. I mean, it's probably a bit of a cliche answer, but like, proper and effective stakeholder engagement is key. But historically, the way that stakeholder engagement has played out, I think, for a lot of utilities and governments is, it's whoever shows up at the council meeting, or whoever shows up at the board meeting, or whatever the public kind of forum is. And that cuts out a large fraction of the population. Really, it's not, energy wonks like us, sure, will probably consider showing up on a Friday evening to a meeting or submitting comments. But the vast majority of folks that these policies can impact, are harder to engage, and being very intentional about engaging with community-based organizations, I would say, and engaging with historically underrepresented groups in these stakeholder proceedings is key.
Yeah, I actually would love to see more, capacity building, I guess, for clean energy stakeholders. To your point, it's expensive to participate in a regulatory proceeding. It's time consuming to go sit in public hearings. We need to sort of strengthen our ability as clean energy advocates to show up. And I think we punch above our weight because people are so passionate about solving the problems in front of us. But we certainly can't compete politically with some of like the larger legacy entities that are out there. So, that this is not necessarily a policy maker comment, but more for the industry side and for our allies and NGOs and others of just continuing to rally, pool resources, hopefully find more resources just to build that ability to show up, because so many decisions get made by a couple folks in a late afternoon meeting that will determine the ultimate future of clean energy in America. Marshall, do you have any thoughts from a public policy perspective, what you might highlight for anyone who works in that space?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you with what Amy just said. It's like being part of that conversation is extraordinarily hard. Like we're only able to do it now because being in organizations that we've joined that have a focus on policy and interaction. But before that, we had almost no voice. One of the things that we struggle with right now, because what we're building at Calvin is really predicated on the finances, right? And all the things that are coming around. And one of the most enabling things that's happened pre-GGRF is the federal tax credit. And we don't know anything, like we think we know how it works, but we don't yet. And so being able to really learn more about it and have definitive answers on that is one of our biggest priorities right now. So if I were just to be very selfish and say what we needed, it's clarity on those tax credits and potentially a voice on how the tax credits are being formed.
Can you add a little more on that? To what extent are you talking about which tax credits and what kind of clarity would you like?
So the IRA tax credits for energy efficiency or decarbonization, the 30% coverage or 40% if you're doing low income. Right
Section
now,
48 for the third party owned systems, is that right? That businesses can claim?
You're getting beyond my pay grade in quoting numbers like that. But yeah, it's the tax credit that everyone's going to be using for, on a basis for a project basis, right? You deploy a project, it costs $1 million. 30% of that can be covered by tax credits. And and there are certain situations where those tax credits, where that basis is modified by particular things, right? If we go into a building and the building is getting the tax credit and they get a huge incentive from the utility, that utility gets taken out of the basis. So they get far less federal tax credits. If we form, and this is a literal example, if we form a third party entity that's funded through someone who's not associated with the building, they can get the entire credit, and it doesn't matter if the utility gives an incentive. So there's these weird situations where, and there's a long history of this happening, right, with solar tax incentives. So clarification around that and pretends loosening the rules to allow more money to be put into these things. It just makes the economics better. It's not like we're going to make more, all that money's going into our pockets. It's making these things work for low-income communities.
What you're talking about is you have a cost of a project, but local incentives get subtracted out. Anything you get in through a local incentive, you don't get to claim the federal tax credit on. So you're saying, hey, let's couple these programs together. That's an interesting point.
Yeah.
Great. So maybe let's hear more about some of the projects you've got going on. We talked about the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. Devin, I think Utility API has some interesting work you're doing in this space. I think you call it building decarbonization in a box. Talk to me a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So, as we're talking, you guys we're just talking about what can policymakers do, right? And how can we simplify this or speed this up? So something that we are piloting actually across 8 communities in the US, just, really diverse and different types of cities, Atlanta, Georgia, Fort Collins, Colorado, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Los Angeles County, is this idea of like, well, how do you attack this problem and bring the different pieces so that a policymaker at a local level can just simply say, yeah, this sounds good, let's hit go, right? How can we have a template or a defined program in place? And so we're working with we're going to make a bigger announcement next week, but I'll preview it a bit with some really wonderful funders and some other companies where essentially a city can have help identifying underperforming buildings, getting the financing needed to address the concerns there, and the contractors and the folks that are needed to do the work, right? And that's a sustainable, profitable program. And we're piloting it with these 8 cities so that we can show in support of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund before the capital is even deployed, like, hey, these are the type of programs that will work on a local level. And that really came out of this idea of, hey, how can we all work together across this sector to to make a difference and do it now. You know, and so that came about with you know, some funding from Elemental Accelerator. So we're really happy to appreciate their support, and then some support also from Rockefeller Brothers Fund. Right, these are names of organizations, nonprofits that have been doing this type of work forever, and then some great partners as well. A company called Electrify, a company called SRS. It really is ability and utility API, of course, but the goal is like, all right, well, how do we bring some of the legislation and policy back to that local level? And how do we work with community groups in these cities to actually go out there and get some work done? And so one side, we try to be extremely kind of like make it a template, like you just do this thing. But it's amazing how in each city they're able to see how different pieces really affect their local community and how they want to implement that. But at the end of the day, the financing is financing, right? The technical assistance is technical assistance, right? The contracting work is contracting work. And so the different pieces that have to be put together can look the same throughout each city, but their program can have some differences. And so we're really excited to see how that goes, and to have these 8 cities raise our hand, and you know, we'll make some more noise about that, you know, hopefully next week. But we're really excited about that one.
We'll preview.
Yeah.
Amy, over to you. Can you tell us a little bit more about a project that's on the horizon you're excited about, or maybe not a specific project, but maybe a specific tech you're harnessing? If I'm not mistaken, you're harnessing artificial intelligence in certain ways to you know, make your offering even better. Tell us a little bit more about how that works.
Yeah. So in terms of kind of different projects or different tech, I guess I can focus on the tech question. And so we do, you know, leverage AI in a variety of ways. I mean, some of the AI we leverage is pretty boring. Actually, it's you know, just like text recognition, for instance, which is relevant for this use case, but hasn't necessarily been deployed in an end-to-end solution in the past. But if anyone is, you know, if, anyone here has kind of participated in a rebate program recently, yeah, curious to hear about your experience. I mean, typically it involves a lot of forms. It involves a lot of like web portals. Sometimes they're paper forms. There normally always is at least a paper option for folks who don't have digital access. But it's also just a lot of manual data entry. And so, you know, some of it's just automating and kind of streamlining that that process of completing these applications, which, you know, leverages OCR, for instance. And so that's kind of on the boring end of the spectrum. There's a lot of AI in between. On the more kind of exciting end of the spectrum, I would say, you know, large language models have definitely shaken things up. I would say over the past year or whenever, yeah, I guess it's been maybe a half year. In terms of, you know, kind of where they really shine, you know, they can shine where you have a bunch of unstructured data that you're trying to glean insight from. And if you think about it, like policy is often just a bunch of unstructured data. It's often in regulatory filings and staff reports. It's on websites. And so, you know, leveraging large language models and generative AI, there's a nice application, basically that type of AI to making policy accessible. In our case, we're focused on incentives, leverage it for other sorts of policy as well, including, for instance, you know, participating in RFP processes, participating in grant processes. And I think, Julie, you had mentioned there are a lot of startups out there now kind of exploring a variety of different, you know, different use cases, leveraging a lot of exciting technology. So that's what I would highlight.
Awesome. Yeah, it's great to see how the clean tech is harnessing other tech to accelerate. I mean, we'd be missing the boat if we weren't. So it's cool to see it move into that space. Let's go to you, Marshall, for any specific projects or any project you've done recently that you think it really is emblematic of like what we can do today with these types of solutions.
Totally. And I can actually hit on some of the questions and answers I saw popped up. So it's a few things before I get to the really exciting project. We do finance our deployments. Most of our sales last year and this year are low-income communities who don't have the capital to do projects. So last year we launched a subscription model where buildings pay a low, you know, monthly fee per apartment, and we work with a third party to finance the deployment. And that was enabled by the IRA, you know, the tax credits. Like that tax credit contribution makes that possible. So we signed a $100 million debt facility 2 weeks ago with a company called ClearGen, who's a Blackstone company. That's super amazing for us. And then we just got authorized for a contract with Con Edison for a demand response contract that would finance the deployment of about 40,000 heat pumps in New York City. To put that in perspective, that's more apartments than could be funded by the entirety of the New York State HERA incentive. So it's using grid services to get the utilities to pay for stuff, leveraging all that the capital stack that's available through tax credits and utility incentives, et cetera, to make a vast impact on low income communities in New York City. So that is a project that we'll be doing for the next 2 years, but it just shows like the scale of what we can do that's enabled by financing and all these awesome things that are going on in terms of, you know, GGRF, tax credits, et cetera.
I think what's important there is you're showing value. It's not just like this incentive goes into like out the window and done. It's actually supporting a business model where the utilities are getting a service and compensating you for a service. The capital and the policies are being used to start that and get it going with a new solution and a new business model. But in theory, this is just self-replicating. It's just using buildings and harnessing them as a resource, like you would a power plant, but using them to throttle up and down or use at different times of day, I imagine, or whatever the services you're offering, and getting the utility to compensate for that because the utility is getting a benefit too.
That's exactly right.
Symbiotic.
And keep in mind, like all the rivet generation that the utilities are compensating us for are summer peak air conditioning conditions. And if you think that our electricity grid is going to get more stressed in the winter if we start electrifying our cities, it's going to become a much bigger issue. And so being part of that grid services platform, I think can only feed more and more electrification projects.
Right. I mean, we're talking about summer, peak conditions. There's also just we're returning to load growth in America. We are now seeing with the reindustrialization of the country and growing AI solutions, the need for data centers, growing to meet need for electrons. That was not the case for the past 30 plus 40 years, perhaps, I think since the 90s. So we need more electrons in general, and we need them at specific times of day. And so throttling, using all the resources in our toolkit, all the tools available, including buildings, is going to be super key. Because we can't just build endless power plants and that sit idle half the year and suddenly ramp up for that one hot day. So we're going to have to think a lot more dynamic about how we solve these problems. All right, I'm going to go to some of the questions here. Let's see. We have a question about, can the panelists speak briefly to any anecdotal evidence that capital has become pickier about what kinds of projects are being financed? Does anyone want to talk about how capital is becoming pickier these days?
I could definitely do that. I mean, like, I think most obviously, well, in terms of project finance, it's just, you know, interest rates, right? So whereas 5 years ago, you know, it was a golden age of finance. As you know, interest rates went up, projects became less profitable, and those stopped working, right? So that's just one. I think probably the biggest impact on pickiness in terms of financing today is that it's tough. Like the margins are slim on all these efficiency products and electrification projects, and you have to have good access to low cost capital and make them work. So I just point out that one aspect. Yeah,
it is interesting. I mean, that's kind of goes maybe to the unicorn mentality. Everything has to be this grand whiz bang, like massive returns, instead of like a really solid business that solves some problems and makes everyone good returns in the meantime. It's sort of a different approach and different mentality, right? Than trying to like have your massive exit, but rather create a lot of healthy companies across the country that solve real problems. And hey, maybe we can export those solutions too, but is a little bit different approach, different multiple maybe perspective. To branch that out a little bit more, Devin, maybe would you comment on the state of like the startup ecosystem in America today? You talked about working with accelerator programs. You know, what's happening in the private sector side to complement what's happening in the public sector side?
Yeah, I appreciate that, because I think I know the last question was about projects, but I think the same question can be asked about companies and investing in companies and capital deployment to companies. You know, we had a couple of years ago where it was basically, you know, with 0% interest rates or very low interest rates, you know, the money cannons were just turned on. People were just trying to find places to get a return, and people were willing to take a lot of bets. Well, we're in the opposite environment now, where you know, the cost of capital is pretty high, and investors and people that are looking to make a return have to be much more picky with where they're deploying and who they're investing in. And I'm not going to say that our sector is an exception, but it is definitely made to be a little more attractive in this environment because of the policy work that's being done, because of things like the Inflation Reduction Act, right? Like there's a there's a long-term potential for this industry. Like it's no longer trying to invest in clean tech the way it was in, 10 years ago, which there's a lot of companies, like my company included, has been around for 10 years, right? So we've seen this movie before. It's a little different now with, oh, there's actually, this industry is here to stay. There's that staying power, but at the same time, you've already mentioned it, Julia, right? Like this industry, we work with states, utilities, local municipalities, cities, counties, all these words that are usually for investors mean run, because you are talking about long-term cycles. Budgets last years, not quarters. Decisions take years. But the flip side, just as you said, that means there's a lot of opportunity for long-term growth. And so what we're seeing as startups is you got to be able to prove that you're a pretty bankable business. No longer can you just prove that if you just pour a bunch of money here, oh, just give us a few years and we'll just give you your unicorn, right? You have to show that each step of the way you have a business that will grow, that consumers want to buy what you're selling them, and that you will have a strong pipeline to balance off some pretty robust growth, which is great. That just means build a good business, right? So if you're going to do that, the opportunities are going to be there. And I think the Inflation Reduction Act and the policies help us show where that's going to be there for years to come.
Right. Recognizing we're sort of rounding the bend, and we'll take the full hour if we need to, or if we'll kind of keep the conversation moving here. So Amy, want to give you an opportunity to respond to anything that's been said, but throw a new one at you at the meantime. You can take your pick of how you want to tackle this. I thought there's a great question put forward about the lone wolf mentality toward climate issues versus bringing the wolf pack together. And the question specifically is, what other resources and organizations should the audience know about that are working together to tackle these issues and opportunities? So if you have a burning response to anything we've covered, please start there. But we'd really love your thoughts on like bringing folks together and any organizations or initiatives people should know about.
Great. Yeah, great question. In terms of, opportunities to collaborate, I would say historically in the clean energy space, there has been a pretty a strong degree of collaboration, at least from my perspective. We have some really great, strong industry associations, from in solar, now in storage. We also have, of course, Rewiring America on the scene. Building Decarb Coalition is a fantastic organization, speaking of nonprofit organizations focused on buildings. We also have, a variety of different, like specifically, kind of other sorts of nonprofits that kind of form that convening, basically function. And so I would say, historically, from my perspective, there has been a lot of collaboration across different companies, even companies that are competing, because there's a lot more in common that those companies are looking to overcome to help kind of advance the entire industry, and that they know that they can kind of we can achieve more if we're working together on those sticky points, specifically related to policy and regulation, and ensuring that that's moving in the right direction. Because as you pointed out, that's what can really make or break markets. And so that's what comes to mind, for me. And it's actually pretty, from my perspective, it's been pretty kind of positive and healthy. But I'm sure there's more opportunity, to work together as well. So would welcome, other folks in the panel to kind of highlight, what they're seeing in the industry, or you as well, Julia, if there are specific opportunities.
Marshall, anything you want to add there first? Opportunities to collaborate, come together.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
like this, obviously.
Yeah, from a hardware perspective, there's a lot of people want to just reinvent the wheel a lot. Like investors often ask us, like, are you developing your own heat pump? It's like, no, absolutely not. Like there's so many heat pumps out there. Why wouldn't we just work with a company who's putting a lot of effort into it and use their technology? And I think so, there is that mentality of like, I'm creating value with my company and I have to have all of it. It's all mine. There's a lot of value to go around, and there's a lot of benefit to working with organizations that are aligned with you and solving a problem, and like being okay with like sharing some of that value with them.
Have anything to add on this front? You're good.
Let's keep moving.
We can give a shout out to Clean Energy for America for playing a role
Yeah.
in being a collaborator for sure. It is
one
of those missing elements of how do you get people together across different sectors. Maybe we'll talk about hydrogen or geothermal another day. I'm seeing some folks in the chat who I know are in those industries. But sorry, you're about to say something.
Maybe because we're in the middle of this, I just kind of take it for granted that this sector, the like Clean Energy for America example you gave, is that we are just wired, forgive the pun, to work collaboratively, right? Like we are, I love what Marshall talked about. There's plenty of value to go around, right? Like a federal official one time told me, Devin, there's plenty of money here. Meaning like this industry has the opportunity to grow together. And Amy, as you talked about, like we're all helping each other out, right? And that's just been the ethos for my entire experience in working in the climate sector, right? We're working on a bigger issue than just building profitable companies. Obviously, we want to build the best profitable company we can, but we also have a goal of electrifying this nation and decarbonizing this nation and to have an impact on climate change. And so if we are ended up fighting with each other instead of pushing after that goal, we're not only hurting our bottom lines, we're hurting our ultimate goal in the process. So it's just ethos for this entire industry.
I agree with that, but I just also here, let me add a wrench to it though.
Throw a wrench.
Throw a wrench. We're gonna throw a wrench. Maybe I put my journalism hat and say, look, we've got infighting too. We can't build big things in many places because environmental concerns are maybe in conflict with building large renewable energy projects. We are struggling with, on the distributed energy side, how to properly set electricity rates. There's a question in the chat about California's NEM 3.0 decision, influence another tax on net metering. Of course, that's where the electrons exported from a homeowner's home from their solar panels that they purchased, the utility compensates them for because they're going back into the grid and being sold to another neighbor. But what is the right amount to compensate that homeowner for? These are really active debates that take a lot of time and frankly do, I think, qualify as infighting, because I think the utilities in a lot of places want to decarbonize. A lot of them have big, bold goals, but we're fighting over who gets what portion of the pie. And a lot of time and effort is unfortunately going there rather than working collaboratively around that highest level goal of decarbonizing and accelerating America's like clean energy economy and bringing all the jobs and economic growth that come with that. So I think it is a challenging time. The question in the chat was, how do we mobilize the electrification industries to push pro solar bills? I would say we have to think about the buildings as a unit and unite together about what are the policies that support electrification, efficiency, distributed energy generation, and then harnessing all those together to provide the grid resources, which we touched on earlier, in new and different ways. I still see HVAC industry, heat pumps in one category. Solar's kind of doing its own thing. Some more developed companies are thinking about software solutions and virtual power plants. And we collaborate, but maybe not as much as we could. And I see that come to fruition in the form of who files comments on public proceedings that are happening. And sometimes it's one trade group or another, but we're not always as aligned as maybe we could be. So maybe there's frankly a gap in the collaboration space to find out how we can come together even more so and shape what we want the future to look like. Not in an antagonistic way with utilities or others, but thinking through how do we build those relationships to try and solve the bigger problem at hand, which is, again, accelerating clean energy. Amy, looked like you had something you wanted to add there. No? Okay, great.
I love that. I love what you're saying about that, because I think the NEM issues in California really highlight that. When I was talking about the collaboration across the industry, I was really focusing on like the startup community and banding together, right? But California is they're saying that it's inequitable, that only certain rich people can afford solar and certain poor people can't. And so we're only giving the benefits to the transition to a certain class of folks. And we want to figure out how to change that. Did they do the right thing? I don't know. And so that tension is there. And I think that California aggressively went in one direction, and you have other states trying to learn from that. And so what I do appreciate that was like the boldness to act, right? Was it the right call? I don't know. But we can learn from that. And so each state's going to be its own, go back to the sort of local decision making, going to make a decision based on how they think it can best affect their state, which goes back to what you were saying, Julia, though. They should be hearing from more than just one interest group. I think in California's example, California heard from really only one group, and not enough from others. And so made a decision based on that. And that I think is where that cohesive kind of voice really comes into play. But I've never got fault for folks for trying something here, right? Like California was way out in front. The reason why it's NEM 3.0 means that there's been one and there's been two, right? They're on version 3 when other states haven't even done anything yet, right? And so I think that's where back to the policy stuff we're talking about here today. it does have real ramifications in the market. NEM
Mhm.
3.0 might have permanently damaged California's solar market, right?
That's the challenge, right? Is
That's a
the
challenge.
power that's in that body. There's 17,000 jobs lost and
Yes.
dozens of companies that have gone bankrupt since that NEM 3 decision was made. And to your point, there's always a time to evolve policies, and not to make this a NEM 3.0 panel, but in response to the question, probably there was a time to evolve policies in California, but how that looks is so key. And
Yep.
educating the policymakers on what the industry needs. For instance, they want to promote battery storage. Well, it's really hard to get batteries these days. The supply chain is not fully available, even if every customer wanted one tomorrow. So how do we align our public policy decisions with what the industry can feasibly do? If again, we're all agreed that we're trying to hit California's really bold climate targets, what's that going to take? The state's own plan says we have to triple or quadruple distributed energy and solar by the end of the decade. So how are we going to get there? And at a moment where we're seeing jobs lost move to other states, and other states now taking this up when it's probably premature because they don't have the solar penetration that California does. Where that conversation was needed, other states, maybe it's premature. So this is where, again, we got these great incentives and directional, positioning from the federal level, but so much is going to play out here at the state levels and how these decisions are made. Marshall, I see you kind of nodding your head. Anything you've said that's been said recently you want to tack on to?
No, I'm just in full agreement over here.
I love it. All right, Amy has another question. Amy talked about getting more than the policy wonks engaged on local type permitting or discussions related to this subject. She's absolutely correct. In some areas of the Midwest, local rural populations are quick to digest information and rally against even what I see as strong clean energy project benefits. A few positive folks providing feedback will be drowned out by vocal opposition. It's a little bit more of a comment than a question there, but Amy, does that tee up any thoughts for you about how to maybe engage with local populations as we execute projects?
Yeah, maybe it relates as well to the question you had asked before, Julia, just on the subject of policy and kind of observations. I would say it's helpful if local staff, policymakers at the utility level, the local level, the state level, have competitive compensation packages. That makes such a big difference to attract talent into these positions that have such amazing influence, over the entire trajectory of a state. And so that's a little bit of a side comment, but it definitely relates to this, because if you have, people that are motivated as well as, kind of appropriately compensated in terms of, market rate compensation, and aren't attracted to, other positions where, they may have less of an impact but make more money, then I think you're going to end up with some smart people that can kind of tell the difference, basically, and understand that it doesn't, can basically kind of weed through some of the very squeaky wheels and such that they are understanding that it's not necessary, when and if it's not necessarily representative of the broader population, and kind of stand up to that. I mean, ultimately though, these decisions they're political, obviously, if it's at a municipal level or at a state level. And so in any time that is the case, certainly working with community-based organizations to build up a case from the start for a particular policy and being engaged is particularly helpful if there's a really solid foundation going forward prior to even reaching a point where it's getting a vote.
Right. We have a few more questions, but I'm going to kind of pick two to round us out here. Marshall, I'll go to you for this one next. You've all said building decarbonization depends significantly on state and local policy, raising the stakes for engaging in policy making at those levels. The question is, as businesses, how do you decide which new states and markets to expand to? The suggestion here is to engage with existing state and local advocacy groups. They often flow below the radar of the national organizations, but do critical work. But the fundamental question is, how do you think about expanding to new states and markets? And maybe not just how do you decide, I'd ask you, how do you do it if that's on your roadmap? Because there is stakeholder building that needs to happen.
Yeah, for sure. Honestly, the first step is just math, right? We look at the utility incentives that are available, and we start talking to people in those regions. We have a lot of incoming interest from people all over the world. And when we speak to people and we think we have the capacity to expand to those locations, then we start really embarking on that engagement. And I would flag right here, as Devin has, Elemental Accelerator, which we're part of also, has a square partnership model where you have a project somewhere, awesome. one of the biggest indicators of success is going to be if you engage with the community in that region as part of that project. And so that's something that we are trying very hard to do. I think it's kind of the opposite of what that question was advising, which is to engage community before you do that. It's something that we don't really have the resources to do, but one day maybe we will, and we do hope to have a voice in the places where we think we're valuable to try to influence, what policymakers are thinking in terms of incentives, what is needed to get things done in their communities. But I generally agree entirely that community engagement is enormously important.
Well, hopefully anyone on this call, if they have questions for each of your individual companies or want to partner, and seen some specific ones in the questions, Clean Energy for America will hopefully be able to be a resource there in connecting folks who have specific questions about where these companies are going next, how they're serving specific demographic groups and customers. My last question I want to end with before we throw it back to our host is looking forward. I think there's a great question in here. No question that the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act and the IRA have changed the clean energy landscape. In 3 years' time, what might be the next wave of transformational policy or legislation? You can focus it on policy or legislation. Maybe I'll even say, is there any other development that you think will be critical in this sort of 3 to say 5 year time frame? So looking forward, what do you think will be the next wave of transformation, policy-wise, or we'll let you even say technology if you think that's where we should focus more. Devin, let's go to you.
I'm gonna not just do the default and say AI.
Yeah, that's
right?
lame now. That's done.
That's lame, right? But like, okay,
So 5 minutes ago.
yeah, so 5 minutes ago. I know. Amy's already covered it. I think one of the challenges in our market is, you already touched on it a bit, which is the increased amount of electrons that are just needed and the ability to get those from different places, like the distribution and the transmission network, right? We are going to be successful in developing new ways to generate electricity, to use electricity, to electrify everything. We have demands with manufacturing being brought back on shore, and the data centers that are needed for AI, where this industry is going to have to figure out how to control not only the costs of moving these electrons around, but also the efficiency with which they're going to do it. And it's all stuck in policy, really, right? Like, not all, but to build these lines, to build these systems, to enable the software that's needed to orchestrate this, you have to change the way that the permitting process is being built and done, the interconnect process, the way that we build new transmission lines, right? We have what we need to fix the system, to upgrade the system, right? It's the world's biggest machine, right? We should be proud of that. It's pretty cool. But now it's time for us to really enable this machine to do what we need it to do, right? It's hours come. And so we, in the next 3 to 5 years, have to solve that roadblock. And luckily, that's something that's not really a physical challenge. It is a policy challenge. And so I think we have the opportunity to do that.
I love that. Yeah, I work on distributed energy issues, but I want to be clear. I love the grid. I think it's fantastic. We get power that stays on, and I get a light whenever I want it. It's pretty fantastic, but there's so much more we can do to upgrade this 100+ year old machine. And we got to find ways to speed that up. Amy, over to you. 3 to 5 years from now, what would you highlight? And then go to Marshall to close it out.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, policy related to workforce development would be what I highlight. We focus on workforce development a lot at Rock Rabbit, just kind of through our product, enabling access to these incentives. But it's really been pretty eye-opening, kind of the challenges that exist. Getting a little bit closer to basically installers and getting closer to kind of the pipeline challenges that are there. So, for instance, I'm in Vermont at the moment, and there's a local law that says all existing buildings need to be, insulated by a certain date. The wait time is 2 years to get a contractor to come out just to do the site visit. We are, hundreds of thousands of electricians and HVAC technicians short of where we need to be to carry out all of these projects. And we have this, really fantastic, these generational bills, but I think more needs to be done on the workforce side to really help build up the pipeline. These are really fantastic jobs. These are good jobs. It's going to be instrumental for the American middle class.
That's a good way to showcase Clean Energy for America's Faces of Clean Energy program. And there's a link in the chat to check out some of the people who are in this industry doing that work, but we absolutely need to attract more folks into this sector. And frankly, it's one of the biggest, most exciting job creation opportunities I think our country has in front of us, except for maybe AI. But AI is taking those jobs anyway. We need folks to do the doing, get in the building. So I think we could do a whole other webinar on workforce development. But Marshall, in our final minute here, what would you highlight? 3 to 5
Yeah,
years.
I agree with everyone. The thing that I always think about is grid. There's going to be, so if you like, I'll skip the math for everybody. But if 10% of New York City electrified its heating, you'd have brownouts in the winter, and you cannot have brownouts in the winter. So we have to be doing things not only to boost the capacity of the grid, but also to be able to absorb and redistribute that energy on in a distributed manner. So which is what we focus on. And what grid scale batteries focus on. Like that's how you take solar, wind, base load, and how you even it all out, right? You need to be able to flex that load around, and it's a huge challenge. And it all goes back to policy.
Well, look, really appreciate everyone on the panel spending time with us, everyone in the audience spending time with us. I know there's some really busy folks in the chat. I recognize some of the names, and everyone taking time out to do this networking and building together is really important as we level up to like, what's it going to take to accelerate the clean energy revolution, if you will, in America. So with that, thank you again, Craig. We'll hand it back to you to close this out here.
Thank you so much, Julia, and thank you to Amy, Marshall, and Devin for the really insightful and engaging conversation today. CE4A will be hosting more conversations like this throughout the rest of this year, including our next one on April 23rd, actually on grid and transmission infrastructure. So please make sure to check our social pages for that registration link in the next couple of weeks. But thank you so much for attending, and hope to see you there.